and welcome to this session of Business Breeders, a live webinar series hosted by Goodman Group at Brock University. My name is Abdul Rahimi, and it's my pleasure to serve as the director of Goodman Group here at Brock University. Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth through accredited professional development certificate programs, consulting services, executive education, and startup support. It's my pleasure to welcome the many who are able to join us live as part of today's webinar series. This webinar series aims to provide 45-minute breathers filled with insightful discussions on timely topics that are relevant to businesses and everyday lives, which are led by our award-winning Brock University faculty, as well as leading industry experts who encourage thoughtful debate and keeping us all feeling connected all together. This webinar series is hosted on Wednesdays at 11 to 11:45. Momentarily, I will hand the screen over to today's webinar lead. That's Brock Dickinson, who will be discussing in the area of green entrepreneurship and the next economy. Brock will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll spend some time answering your questions. You may pose your question at the time of registration, which many of you have done so, but also I would encourage you to type your questions in the chat feature, which is open now. You may also tweet your questions and comments at GSB Goodman Group. That is at GSB Goodman Group, all one word. And at the end of the webinar, I will provide some details on how you may access today's recordings as well. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you today's webinar lead, and that is Brock Dickinson, who is an entrepreneur in residence and an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo. In this role, Brock works with students and faculty to help launch new entrepreneurial ventures, commercialize emerging research, and support the development of new incubation and business acceleration projects. Brock was previously the CEO of MDB Insight, Canada's largest specialist economic development consultancy, where he worked with some 300 communities across North America to identify and pursue economic development, investment attraction, and job creation opportunities. The company was named to Profit Magazine's Hot 50 list of Canada's fastest growing startups. He sold the company in 2017. Before entering the private sector, Brock served in a variety of local economic development roles across North America and spent 6 years as a consultant to the United Nations, coordinating environmental projects in more than 30 countries. In 1995, he was appointed Secretary General of the UN Development Conference, the youngest Secretary General in UN history. Brock also serves an executive in residence with Innovate Niagara, sits on the Industry Advisory Board of Canadian Food and Wine Institute Innovation Center, and is a member of Niagara Free Trade Zone Task Force. He also advises NAFTA or USMCA on environmental innovation. He is also a widely published writer and a popular public speaker. He is also a Brock alum. Brock, welcome.
Thank you very much, Abdul. I appreciate the very kind introduction. And I always say that one of the things that stands out in my background is that I obviously can't hold a job as I move around quite a bit. But hopefully that will help today, as I'm actually going to be looking at a whole range of issues and how they're interconnected under this broad umbrella that I've called green futures. And I'm going to try to draw on thinking in the field of innovation, in entrepreneurship, in sustainability, to talk a little bit about where our economy heads next. And I wanted to start with the concept of entrepreneurship. And I think instinctively we know that entrepreneurship has become a sort of a key feature of the economy. But I don't think we always understand how important it has been to the economy in recent years. There was a really fascinating study done in 2011 at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Massachusetts. Three researchers there, John Halterwanger, Ron Carman, and Javier Miranda, published an article coming out of that research called Who Creates Jobs? Small versus Large versus Young, in which they tried to understand, in the knowledge economy, in the space that we're in today, who is it that actually drives job creation? Is it multinationals? Is it big companies? Is it startups? Is it the tech sector? What their research showed was that in that period between 2000 and 2010, the key driver of job creation in the North American marketplace was companies less than 5 years old, that is, entrepreneurial ventures. And in fact, their research showed that all of the net new job creation in North America in that decade arose from job creation driven by those companies less than 5 years old. And so we've come to recognize that entrepreneurship is one of the key drivers of the economy that we're in at the moment. And entrepreneurship is something that we've been sort of studying and thinking about for many years. And so as it becomes more important, it sometimes is helpful to step back and kind of think about where much of our concept of entrepreneurship comes from. So not too long ago, one of the key thinkers in this space was Peter Drucker, the management theorist. Back in his book, Innovation and Entrepreneurship in 1985, he talked about the things that drove entrepreneurship. What were the forces that led entrepreneurship into innovative spaces? And he described 7 of those forces. But the 7 were sort of characterized by this sense that entrepreneurship and related innovation often arose from surprises, from danger signs, from the unexpected, from incongruities, in a sense from obstacles that people ran into, and that those gave rise to innovative and entrepreneurial responses. In taking this approach, Drucker was actually sort of hearkening back to a previous generation of economists. We can think of the work of Joseph Schumpeter, for example. And Schumpeter was an Austrian economist working in the early part of the 20th century. One of his classic books was Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, back when you could write a book that covered literally every topic possible. But in that book, he developed an idea that he referred to as creative destruction. This notion that challenges, problems, issues, obstacles are often the driver of innovative and entrepreneurial responses. And what he talked about in that book was a kind of an economic churn, this sense that in the marketplace, there were constantly businesses succeeding and constantly businesses failing. And that those businesses that were failing were the ones that had run into obstacles and failed to innovate, had failed to kind of take into account where the market, where the reality around them was headed. And as a result, that failure to adapt had doomed them to decline. And in their place, new businesses arose, either existing businesses that were able to innovate or new entrepreneurial ventures that saw the problems and the obstacles and were able to tackle them and address them directly. Now, Schumpeter sort of coined this idea of creative destruction, but the ideas date back even further. The notion of this kind of creative destruction as a reality of the world around us is a key thought or a key element of Victorian thinking in many areas. So, for example, Charles Darwin in the field of biology in his book On the Origin of Species talked about how the extinction of old forms is the inevitable consequence of the production of new forms. This is the kind of biological equivalent of creative destruction as we see it in Schumpeter, that somehow innovation destroys old ways of doing things and replaces them with new ways. In the economic context, we can see elements of this in the works of Marx and Engels as well. In the Communist Manifesto, they actually use this as a critique of the capitalist system to sort of say, one of the features of capitalism is destruction, that things fade away and get destroyed by new innovations. Now, they saw that in a very negative context as sort of one of the weaknesses of capitalism, but there's this sense that they recognize that the capitalist system inherently is unstable. It has that churn, it has that cycle of creative destruction. And even further back, we can trace this idea all the way back to the work of Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince. This book was first circulated around 1513, so we're talking about an idea that's over 500 years old. And while we tend to think of The Prince as a political work, it also talks about economic issues and about entrepreneurship in particular. Machiavelli actually said in this book that entrepreneurs are simply those who understand that there is little difference between obstacle and opportunity, and are able to turn both to their advantage. That obstacles arise in the economy, and entrepreneurship is the tool that we turn to overcome those obstacles. Well, that's a fairly powerful concept as we start to think about the kinds of obstacles that we face in the 21st century, and in particular, the kinds of global environmental challenges that we're starting to face. There are suggestions, for example, that as much as 80% of the world's coral reefs could die within the next 10 or 20 years. And from an economic perspective, that's an interesting challenge, an obstacle, because if we live, for example, in a fisheries-dependent community, more than 50% of all aquatic species depend at some stage in their life cycle on the availability of coral reef habitat. And so there's this sense that if we kill the coral reef, we will undermine and destroy an entire industry. Or we can think about the challenges that come along with something like global warming. Climate change is obviously leading to the shrinking of the ice cap, which some people have suggested might open up new business opportunities in terms of things like Arctic shipping. But for most communities and most people, we see far more tangible effects at the local level, including the risks in many communities of the loss of waterfront space or real estate. In many communities, that could involve the danger of destruction of their downtown cores, which were traditionally built on waterfronts. And so we sort of see that these emerging challenges are not just kind of environmental in nature, but also have economic implications. We can think of other challenges like the loss of biodiversity, and this is one I'll spend some time on this morning. By some estimates, we are currently losing 3 species of plants or animals every hour. That translates into 72 species per day, 504 species a week, 2,160 species a month, and more than 26,000 species a year. The biodiversity crisis is looming out there as an example of the kinds of issues that we're being faced with on that global front, the kinds of obstacles that environmental concerns are raising. Now, I work a lot in the field of economic development, and as economic developers, as people trying to attract investment and grow business in communities, we know that our local economies and the environment are intrinsically linked. And one of the ways that we sort of often point this out to people is to ask, how would you like to be the economic developer for Chernobyl? There's a sense that if you create environmental destruction and chaos at the local level, you can completely eliminate and undermine the opportunities for business. I think part of what we're talking about is a little more practical and tangible than that as well. So let's think about that biodiversity obstacle for a moment, and let's think about a related obstacle, which is the prevalence of ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer is a disease that actually kills 12,000 women in North America every year. And for many years, this was a disease that we did not have effective treatments for. Until about 15 or 20 years ago, we actually discovered that there was an effective ovarian cancer drug found in the bark of the Pacific yew tree. This drug became known as Taxol. The problem was that having discovered that effective drug, we also realized that the Pacific yew was on the brink of extinction. There were very few living examples of the Pacific yew tree left alive. And if that species had gone extinct, if that biodiversity example had been lost, we would never have found the drug Taxol. In fact, we did find Taxol in time. And as a result, we have developed an entire industry around the farming of the Pacific yew and now other kinds of yew trees. And this is an industry that not only saves 12,000 lives in North America every year, but also generates more than $1 billion in revenue and employs thousands of people around the world. This, to me, is one of those quintessential sort of examples of Machiavelli's idea that obstacles present entrepreneurial opportunities. That as we think about the great challenges that we face in the coming years, those challenges, those obstacles, many of them environmental in nature, will in fact be the seed that leads to many new entrepreneurial ventures. In my work at the University of Waterloo, we're actually trying to create a bit of a taxonomy around the concept of green entrepreneurship, the various types of entrepreneurial ventures that feed into this new green opportunity, where we're looking at environmental obstacles and beginning to develop tools and processes and tactics and techniques that can help to overcome those obstacles. And some of these are going to be the sort of the focus or the center of ideas that I want to explore today. But there is a sense that as we think about these concepts, we're really kind of focusing in on the innovation space. That as we think about new tools, new ideas, new tactics, we're really talking about how innovation might be utilized by entrepreneurs to overcome the obstacles that we're facing. And these days, if we want to talk about innovation, we have to come to the sort of the great guru in the field, and that's Clayton Christensen, who back in 1997 wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which has become the sort of the handbook for everybody who wants to think about innovation as a driver of the economy. And Clayton Christensen's original conception of innovation was that there were principally two kinds of innovation: what he called sustaining innovations and what he referred to as disruptive innovations. Now, sustaining innovations were the kind of minor changes or minor tweaks that a company might make to its product in the face of Schumpeter's creative destruction. If I have to stay ahead of my competition, at every stage of what I'm trying to do, I should be trying to innovate my products at least a little bit so that I don't fall into decline, so that I don't become a victim of destruction. And so if we think of a company like Coca-Cola, there's this constant search to kind of tweak the product, to think about sustaining minor innovations that could be introduced to help my product in the marketplace. So having been successful with Coca-Cola, maybe I can introduce Cherry Coke or lemon Coke or something like this. And after I've done that, I need to continue with sustaining innovations. So maybe I can introduce diet versions of those drinks. And these sustaining innovations kind of develop a bit of an energy and a pattern that requires the companies employing them to sort of keep introducing new sustaining innovations, often fairly minor in terms of their impacts. And of course, those kinds of minor innovations don't occur just in the formulation of the product. They might occur in the field of packaging or marketing, where we can think about minor tweaks that we could make to help promote our product in the marketplace. They could occur in areas like distribution, where we think about how to move our product to market. Traditionally with Coca-Cola, we could think about vending machines, or we could think about soda fountains. We could even really go out on the edge sometimes and try to come up with new approaches. Here's something that Coke experimented with in Japan for a while: giant walking robot vending machines. I love this picture. I look at this with the terrified face of this schoolgirl there who's confronted by this giant Coca-Cola robot. But there is a sense that all companies, if they're trying to survive, will engage in some level of innovation, and those innovations may, in many instances, be quite minor. But Christensen also talked about a different kind of innovation that was much more substantial. That's the concept of disruptive innovation, innovation that could transform or even eliminate entire industries. So we see on the screen here an example of a telegraph or a telegram. There's a sense that telegrams were once ubiquitous, but I don't know anybody who's received a telegram in recent years. There's a sense that this industry that was once quite large has been completely disrupted and destroyed by emerging innovations and technologies. That existing industries, if they don't keep up with disruptive innovations, can be fundamentally transformed and even eliminated in the face of new ventures. Now, Christensen actually talks about what it means to link this concept of disruption with the field of entrepreneurship. And he suggests, for example, that disruptive technologies typically are first commercialized in emerging or insignificant markets. And that's interesting because if we think about it from that context of linking obstacles in entrepreneurship, aren't those emerging or insignificant markets often where the greatest obstacles exist? Aren't they the places that entrepreneurship is most needed? And as we start to think through this, it begins to suggest why places like Silicon Valley or Mumbai or Waterloo become centers of entrepreneurial activity rather than the major established business hotspots or centers around the world. It's a sense that emerging, marginal, insignificant players are the ones that come to the fore. And that idea sort of relates to a whole series of questions that we can start to raise about the innovation space generally. If we think about new tools and new technologies, it becomes obvious that often established players, the companies that have dominated spaces for generations, are not the ones that bring new and innovative ideas to the marketplace. Why wasn't it a typewriter company that invented word processing? Why didn't Walmart build Amazon? Why didn't NBC or some other television network invent YouTube? And in fact, YouTube is a classic example of what Christensen is talking about. We can go back to the very first video ever posted to YouTube. It's called Me at the Zoo. It was uploaded by Jawed Karim, who was one of the founders of YouTube back in April of 2005. It's a 19-second video in which he sort of talks about how long the trunks of the elephants at the zoo are. A pretty sort of obscure beginning to what has become this kind of major content platform on the internet. But the origin of YouTube is kind of revealing in the sense of what it tells us about innovations occurring at the margins. The original 19-second video obviously wasn't much of a threat to the established television networks of the day. They did not necessarily see this kind of interesting platform for kind of personal expression as playing in the same space as the established television networks did. Back in the spring of 2005, when this video was posted, the top television show in North America was American Idol, with about 27 million viewers per week. When Jawed posted this video on YouTube, I'm imagining there might have been a half a dozen views in the original days. It wasn't something that registered as relevant to NBC or as a threat to NBC. Today, this video now has 125 million views. It has been viewed 5 times more frequently than those episodes of American Idol back in 2005. And there's a sense that it points to this notion that extreme innovations, as they occur and as they begin to be introduced to the marketplace, are of little to no interest to established players in the marketplace. Generally, Christensen says, disruptive technologies underperform established products in mainstream markets, but they have features that a few fringe customers value and adopt, and that small fringe begins to grow over time. But because it's initially small, it's not of interest to the managers of established companies. It's not of interest to those making financial decisions in big corporations. And that means that established companies are often the last to adopt or address innovation, the last to address major obstacles, the last to embrace new innovations. And so innovation comes from small players at the margins. And those small players are powered then by these rules and laws that govern the emergence of the knowledge economy. We're all familiar with the concept of Moore's Law, probably. This is the notion first coined by Intel chair Gord Moore back in 1965. He was doing an interview with Electronics magazine and made the statement that we see here on the screen that with price held constant, the processing power of computers doubles every 24 months. Okay, we know the technical notion of what this is. Practically, what does this mean? Well, when Gord Moore made that comment back in 1965, he was probably envisioning the typical computer of the day. It was probably something that took up the entire basement of Intel's offices. But if I went to a computer store today to buy a laptop to use here at home, the computer that I could buy for $1,200 or $1,500 in the store today is 200 million times more powerful than what Gord Moore was thinking of when he thought about Moore's Law. And in just 10 years, in 2030, if I was to go to the same computer store and spend the same amount of money, the computer that I'd be able to buy is 6.4 billion times more powerful than what Moore was thinking of. There's this sense that although innovation starts at the margin, the compounding power of something like Moore's Law means that its impact in the marketplace will accelerate very dramatically over time. Similar concept that's often talked about is something known as Gilder's Law, first coined by George Gilder. This is the notion that the cost of transferring one bit or one piece of information falls by half every 12 months. Again, practically, what does this mean? Well, in 1946, if I'd wanted to make a 3-minute phone call from New York City to London, England, that 3-minute phone call would have cost me $650 US. Today, if I want to make a 3-minute phone call from New York to London, what's the cost? Probably a couple of pennies. Or if I use an online tool like Skype or Zoom, it's free. That is Gilder's Law in action. And we can start to see the implications of these ideas when we think about what it might mean for two companies to compete using opposite ends of that telecommunications spectrum as their platform. If I'm competing against another company and I have a 1946 telephone system and they have a 2020 telephone system, I cannot compete. So companies that embrace these innovative ideas and approaches early go through massive growth spurts. They accelerate far beyond the established players in the marketplace. And this has caused us to start to think about the kinds of companies that have been successful in the knowledge economy. Sometimes we refer, for example, to the FANG group: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. The average age of the FANG companies is 26 years. These are companies that have been around for the blink of an eye, and yet have come to be some of the largest and most dominant firms in the world. And we can start to apply those ideas to what we're likely to see in the environmental space, that we are at the front end of an era of green disruption. Existing experts in many fields have not recognized that the disruption is already underway. Existing companies, even entire sectors of the economy, don't really believe that we're headed for anything of a disruptive nature in the green space. But the environmental equivalent of the YouTubers are already at work. They are already producing these disruptive technologies that will spur a new generation of entrepreneurs and upend existing companies. And in many cases, they're going open source. They're giving their innovations away. We think about Elon Musk, for example, who has given away the technology behind his electric cars. Anybody can access it. He has given away the technology behind his Hyperloop systems. And there's this sense that these innovations that are sort of occurring at the fringes, at the edges of things, are now just starting to create radical transformations in the way that our economy works. And that while we might have expected government to lead in many of these green transformations, it is in fact the entrepreneurial community that's leading the way and is forcing government to react in interesting ways. So, for example, we saw the government of Quebec announce 2 days ago that it will be illegal to sell gas-powered cars in the province of Quebec by 2035. And they're not the first jurisdiction to do this. California, in fact, introduced the same rule back in September. There's this sense that the entrepreneurs that we think of as kind of small players, fringe players, are in fact now beginning to set the agenda of what happens in this green space. And if we want to know where that innovation is going to lead us next, there are some signposts to sort of think about what areas are most ripe for disruption within this new green economy. One of the signposts, one of the guiding structures we can look at is what are known as the global goals, or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a set of 17 goals that the international community has agreed will drive all of our development efforts between the years 2015 and 2030. They are goals that we are working towards as a global community. I think it's really interesting to think about the concept of sustainability in relation to the concept of entrepreneurship. We can look at some sort of standard definitions of entrepreneurship, for example, and here's one that was sort of extracted from Wikipedia a couple of years ago, where entrepreneurship is essentially about arranging or organizing a series of resources to help turn ideas or inventions into viable innovations that can be introduced and sold in the marketplace. Well, let's contrast that definition of entrepreneurship with the actual technical definition of sustainable development that the United Nations wrote in 1984. This is drawn exactly from the original UN document that talked about what sustainable development is. And we can see that there is a very strong, very close parallel between that concept of what entrepreneurship is and what sustainable development actually is. That these ideas are very closely linked. And so as we think about something like the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN is working towards, we can start to see some very obvious implications for that next generation of green entrepreneurs. Some of the goals that the UN has talked about obviously have sort of economic and business and entrepreneurship connections. But some of the others, as we sort of scratch beneath the surface, when we think about things like the need for clean water and sanitation, or the need for affordable and clean energy, to mobilize the technologies and the tools and the techniques to achieve these goals is going to require a new wave of entrepreneurial ventures and skill sets to get these tools out to the communities that need them most. And some of the larger goals that underlie the SDGs, the UN's work in this space, things like the need for a more circular economy based on responsible consumption and production, or the need for global climate action. As we scratch beneath the surface of those, we also start to see that entrepreneurial ventures will be what drives us to act and to succeed in some of these spaces moving forward. And there's this sense that as we start to think about those huge environmental challenges, the obstacles that we as a global community face, and the innovation that's required to move forward on those issues, to solve some of those problems, it's clear that entrepreneurship is the tool that is going to be able to lead us in those directions. And that through the power of those individual entrepreneurs, those fringe players coming up with new ideas, new technologies, looking for the failures of existing companies within that process of creative destruction in order to be able to replace them with new ventures, the next generation of green YouTubers, there's this sense that almost anything will be possible for this next generation of entrepreneurs. And that as they set their sights on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, they will transform not just their own communities, not just their own industries, but perhaps the entire world. I think it'll be an exciting time. I think it'll be a very interesting time for all of us as we work through that green disruption. And I hope that it's something you'll join me in thinking about and talking about as these ideas start to emerge. And at this point, I'd be happy to turn things back to Abdul for some questions.
Brock, thank you very much. Very insightful in there, and you had quotes in there from a number of my favorite authors as well, including a couple of books that I have behind me on the shelf. So, indeed, I quite liked your take on Prince's book. You know, how I have come across it and seen many others think of it as a political work, but of course, there's much more to it. You know, it's one of the things that it speaks to is also in the area of change and how, you know, principalities rise and fall, and it's all in the area of change and entrepreneurship, and change being the only constant, of course, in this setting as well. So very intriguing in that sense. Okay, I've got a couple of questions as I look to my other screen over here to my left. A number of established companies tend to ignore disruptors in their market, YouTube being an example. Why do you think, in your thoughts, some established companies may be less open to innovation and entrepreneurship, and then taking that further to say what could be some of the steps they take to enhance that?
Yeah, I think that, Christensen talks a fair bit in his work about why established companies don't look at this space. And he's quick to point out that this isn't true of all companies, but that it's often kind of the upstarts or the smaller players in the established business community that do this. He talks about the rise of Honda motorcycles in the North American marketplace when competing against Harley Davidson and companies like that. But his general sort of a takeaway is that those that have dominant positions in the existing market often see little need to innovate. If they're interested in innovation, they often don't see the financial opportunity associated with that innovation. So NBC just simply didn't see a path to profitability with a tool like YouTube. And there's a certain sort of caution or hesitancy built into the management structures, a conservative sort of approach to decision-making in the management structures of those large and established corporations. And so they tend, it's not a universal law, but they tend to be more reluctant to innovate. And that creates the space for the smaller player, for the more nimble player, for the entrepreneur just entering the field to kind of move into those fringes of the marketplace and be the early adopter of the new technologies that will come to ultimately transform what's happening within a sector or an industry. And I think this is relevant to this discussion of green entrepreneurship because many of our established players just aren't paying attention to those green innovations. We can think of entire sectors like the oil and gas industry that have not necessarily moved as quickly on these fronts as they could. We can think of the automotive industry where it has been upstarts like Elon Musk that have transformed it rather than the established players like Ford or General Motors. And even when the innovations are freely available because of open source sharing to those established players, they're somewhat reluctant to move in those directions. And so I think the historical examples suggest to us that that model will continue to hold in the shift to a greener economy.
Great, thank you. The next one here speaks to your example about the ovarian cancer drug and how it came from the coral reef or the Pacific reef. In your thoughts and again research, and obviously that provides an economic value, but are there additional values in preserving those areas? And what are some of the steps that you might have come across that may have been taken to preserve that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we're talking in the context of a business school today. I'm talking about the economy and entrepreneurship. And so we have a tendency to sort of describe these things in financial or economic or monetary terms. I am a big believer in the intrinsic value of the natural world and of biodiversity, that these things are important and vital in and of themselves. But that's a moral argument, and it's sometimes hard to convince others of moral arguments. And so I think if we can make multiple arguments at the same time, we're in a much stronger space. So being able to make the moral argument and the financial argument is more effective. I do think there's interesting things that start to happen, though, when we do things that are just generally good, like habitat preservation or biodiversity preservation, that we start to see unintended consequences of that activity. And we can think about the way, for example, through the 80s and 90s, we started to set up rainforest preserves in Central America, and only later began to really realize that those could also be carbon sinks, where we were actually kind of contributing to efforts to combat global warming and climate change. And so often by doing the right thing, by preserving these natural features and characteristics, we're finding that in the long run, it's beneficial from a number of perspectives that we didn't even initially anticipate.
Absolutely. And along that line, in terms of the economic impact of globalization and the impact that it's having on change as a whole and the speed of change, what are some of the measures that you've come across that are being used as metrics of change and globalization? And are any of those effective in slowing down in the areas that we need to slow down, but perhaps speed up in the areas that we do need to speed up, if the old adage of, you know, what you measure gets done were to apply?
Right. There's a whole host of questions nested within that one, so I can't promise I'll cover all of it. But I'm intrigued by this whole concept of globalization, because we tend to sort of portray it as something good or something bad, when in fact it's kind of the water that we're swimming in. It's the reality around us, and whether we're in favor of it again or against it, it's the environment in which we operate. And I think that it has negative features. I mean, we've seen, for example, you know, the sense that the global trade in commodities sometimes has negative consequences if we don't do it sort of carefully. But at the same time, we see the global dissemination of ideas and approaches to things that sort of it's the tide that raises all ships. When it comes to sort of measuring the impacts of these ideas, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we need to be cognizant of or concerned about. I am very conscious of metrics like the Gini coefficient, which talks about the inequalities within societies. This, to me, is one of the features of the globalized environment in which we live. And there's a very real danger that as we embrace innovation and entrepreneurship, we could create a sort of a two-tier society or a two-tier structure, where those that have the tools of the knowledge economy at their disposal, those who have information, those who have knowledge, are able to kind of maximize their economic opportunities. But those who don't necessarily have the same access to those tools are marginalized and left further and further behind. And we end up with this kind of splitting of societies. And I do fear that we've seen some of that over the course of the last 10 years or so. If we think of the rise of nationalism in many parts of the world, if we think of the sort of the movements against sort of collaborative international approaches to dealing with environmental issues. We think even of the rise of people like Donald Trump. There's been these signs that maybe those who have been marginalized are fighting against this emerging system that we're trying to create. And if we believe in a better future, a greener future, a more equitable future, we need to work towards it. And we need to make sure that those marginalized parties are brought into that picture of the future as well, so that they can embrace it and benefit from it rather than perhaps fighting against it.
Excellent, thank you. This next one's about innovation centers. Do you think that they should be a public resource? And if so, how would you advocate for them being economically and financially sustainable?
Yeah, so I think in the broader sense, an innovation center is a public resource in the sense that they are designed to be accessed by people from across the community. Because they tend to be structured in very different ways, they're also accessed in different ways. Some are pay-to-play structures where you actually have to make a financial contribution to be able to access them. Maybe it's a rental payment or some, giving up some equity in your firm or something. But I think there are lots of other structures that are still free and publicly accessible. And so I think about some of the social enterprise incubators and innovation centers that have been created across the country. My belief is that as we really look to kind of build out locally effective innovation ecosystems, we need a little bit of everything. We need the private sector to play in that space. We need the public sector to play in that space. We need not-for-profits to play in that space. And then if we can create a range of structures and supports, that will be what benefits our local economies the most.
Excellent. Brock, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule for being here and discussing this very, very relevant and prevalent topic of, especially in this week, which focuses on the Global Entrepreneurship Week. So very, very timely in that sense, and very appreciative of your time being here.
You're very welcome.
I do want to bring attention to a program that the Goodman Group is bringing up in the new year. I know it's November and we're already looking into the new year. As I said, I have to catch myself that we are talking about the new year, and of course, it's relevant pretty soon. And in this area is particularly in the area of cybersecurity, something that we have all heard of or perhaps experienced in some cases with a number of individuals or sort of in the pandemic world, folks working from home. We have all experienced or at very least read the rise in cybersecurity and cyber-related attacks. And of course, so Goodman Group is pleased to be partnering up with the Supply Chain Canada, the Ontario chapter, to bring this particular a series of seminars in January for folks to be able to sign up for. This is a 2 half-day session that's taking place on the 26th and 27th of January, and it is facilitated by our award-winning faculty member here at Goodman School of Business. So should you have any questions or would like to proceed with reserving your seat, please follow the link below here or email myself or a member of the Goodman Group team, and we'll be very happy to assist you with that. I also want to bring up another area that's a little bit closer to me personally, and that is my new facial feature, and that's November, so the month of November. Of course, this is getting into week 3, and I've been fortunate to be part of this with a group of individuals from the Goodman School, so the good people of Goodman Group, to be particular, which is also happens to be the name of the team. And very much appreciate your donations towards this excellent cause that all of those will go towards in terms of helping both men's health and also women's health as well. So very proud of the team that I'm part of and raising awareness around this area. So yes, this is a temporary look just for the month of November in that sense. Right. As we look towards the next session, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, for being here, for joining us. Next week's session, we'll be looking at boosting your career with community work and volunteering, and that's with Julia Deans, who is the CEO of Habitat for Humanities Canada. And that is next Wednesday at November 25 from 11 to 11:45. I hope to see many of you then. Until then, stay safe.